In the collective imagination, the serial killer exists as a specter of near supernatural intelligence, a phantom moving through the shadows of society, untraceable, unknowable, and always one step ahead. They are the chess masters of life and death, the criminal geniuses whose motivations and methods are so alien, so meticulously planned, that they defy the comprehension of ordinary people and the diligent efforts of law enforcement. This is the myth. It's a narrative spun from decades of fiction, from films that portray them as charismatic anti-heroes, and from the breathless media coverage that often elevates their cunning to legendary status. We are fascinated by the idea of an evil that is not just banal, but brilliant. It is a more comforting thought, in a way, that only a mastermind could commit such atrocities. It places them in a category separate from humanity, a monster from a different realm. But the truth, as documented in the case files of countless investigations, is far more unsettling and, ultimately, far more human. The history of serial murder is not a chronicle of flawless predators. Instead, it is a story of profound and often baffling error. It is a catalog of ego, of carelessness, of psychological compulsions that override self-preservation, and of simple, mundane stupidity. The downfall of these killers is rarely a singular brilliant stroke of detective work. More often, it is a slow unraveling, a thread pulled from a tapestry of their own mistakes. These are the fatal flaws, the critical blunders that transform an untouchable phantom into a flesh-and-blood suspect sitting in an interrogation room. They are the moments when the mask of the mastermind slips, revealing the flawed, fallible, and frequently foolish individual beneath. From taunting letters that contain hidden clues to a forgotten parking ticket, from a desperate need to keep a gruesome souvenir to a fundamental misunderstanding of emergent technology. These mistakes have proven to be the killer's most reliable accomplice in their own capture. Over the next several hours, we will journey into the heart of these investigations. We will dissect 20 of the most common and critical mistakes that have led to the capture of serial killers throughout history. We will examine the forensic evidence, the behavioral errors, and the investigative breakthroughs that ended their killing sprees. This is not a story about celebrating monsters. It is an analytical exploration of their failures. It is the story of how hubris, habit, and humanity's own imperfections ultimately bring even the darkest of predators into the light. Our journey begins with perhaps the most self-destructive impulse a serial killer can possess, the burning, insatiable desire for recognition. For many of these individuals, the act of killing is not enough. The crime must be known, the terror must be felt, and they, the architects of that terror, must be acknowledged, feared, and even perversely admired. This psychological need to be seen, to step out from the shadows and take a bow for their horrific work, has been the Achilles heel of some of the most infamous killers in modern history. It is the mistake of taunting law enforcement and the media. For 30 years, the city of Wichita, Kansas, lived under the shadow of a ghost. He called himself BTK, an acronym for the brutal method he employed: bind, torture, kill. Beginning in 1974 with the horrific murder of the Otero family, BTK established a pattern of terrifying precision and cruelty. He would stalk his victims, learn their routines, and then strike, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable violence. But what set him apart, what truly cemented his place in the annals of criminal infamy, was his communication. He wrote letters to the local newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, and to television stations. In these letters, he reveled in the details of his crimes, he claimed responsibility, he gave himself his now infamous moniker, and he mocked the police for their inability to catch him. He was a phantom who desperately wanted his name to be known, a ghost who haunted not just the streets, but the local headlines. Then, after a series of murders in the late 1970s and a final known crime in 1991, BTK went silent. The letters stopped. The killings ceased. For years, it seemed the ghost had vanished for good. The case grew cold, a chilling piece of local lore. But the fear he had instilled lingered. Detectives retired, new ones took their place. But the BTK files remained open, a testament to a reign of terror that had never truly ended, because its perpetrator had never been brought to justice. The community of Wichita was left with a permanent scar, a sense of unresolved dread. The man who had terrorized them could be anyone, a neighbor, a coworker, a friendly face at the grocery store. Then, in March of 2004, 30 years after the Otero murders, the ghost returned. A letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle containing a copy of the driver's license of Vicky Wegerle, a victim from 1986, and photos from the crime scene. BTK was back, and his ego, seemingly dormant for over a decade, was more inflated than ever. He had re-emerged to reclaim his dark legacy, to ensure he was not forgotten. It was this act of pure arrogance that would set in motion the chain of events leading to his downfall. Over the next year, a flurry of communications followed. He sent packages containing jewelry from his victims, bizarre drawings, and rambling letters. He was playing a game, a cat-and-mouse chase with a police force now armed with technology that didn't exist during his prime. The Wichita Police Department, under the leadership of Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, handled the situation with remarkable patience and strategic cunning. They played along with BTK's game, understanding that every communication was an opportunity, a chance for him to make a mistake. BTK was a killer from another era, a product of the 1970s. His understanding of technology was dangerously outdated, a fact he seemed blissfully unaware of. In one of his packages, he included a question, a moment of profound miscalculation that investigators could scarcely believe. He asked the police, in writing, if he could communicate with them via a floppy disk without being traced. He wanted to know if it was safe. This was the moment the entire investigation pivoted. The police had a choice. They could ignore the question, or they could set a trap. They chose the latter. In a carefully worded, classified ad in the local paper, a method of communication they had established with the killer, they replied with a simple, deceptive message. It was safe. They lied. They gambled on his technological ignorance and his overwhelming desire to be heard. On February 16, 2005, the gamble paid off. A padded envelope arrived at KSAS-TV, a local Fox affiliate. Inside was a Memorex floppy disk. BTK had taken the bait. The disk was rushed to a forensic computer lab, where experts began the delicate process of extracting every piece of data it contained. The killer had attempted to wipe the disk, but traces of deleted files remained, like digital ghosts in the machine. Forensic analysts recovered a deleted Microsoft Word document, and embedded within the metadata of that document, the digital fingerprint that tracks a file's history, were two crucial clues. The document was last modified by a user named Dennis, and it was associated with an institution, the Christ Lutheran Church. The 30-year-old ghost story was finally being distilled into a single, tangible lead. Investigators quickly searched for anyone named Dennis associated with that church. The search returned a name, Dennis Rader, the president of the church council. A quick background check revealed more. Rader lived in nearby Park City. He had been in the Air Force, and he had worked for ADT Security Services, which chillingly explained his knowledge of alarm systems and how to bypass them. He fit the profile. The phantom was beginning to take on a face. But they needed more. They needed his DNA. To obtain it without alerting their prime suspect, investigators secured a warrant for a pap smear that had been taken from Rader's daughter at the Kansas State University Medical Clinic. It was a long shot, but familial DNA analysis was a powerful new tool. The lab worked quickly. They compared the DNA profile from the daughter to a semen sample that had been preserved from the 1986 Vicky Wegerle crime scene. The results came back. It was a match. The DNA of the man's daughter was consistent with the DNA of the killer. The statistical probability was overwhelming. After 3 decades of terror, mystery, and silence, they had him. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader, the church council president, the Boy Scout leader, the seemingly ordinary family man, was pulled over during his lunch break and arrested. The ghost that had haunted Wichita for a generation was finally exorcised, not by a brilliant deduction in the heat of the moment, but by a killer's own vanity and a simple floppy disk. His need to be heard was the very thing that silenced him forever. This pattern of ego-driven communication is not unique to BTK. In the sweltering summer of 1976, New York City was a metropolis on edge, grappling with a financial crisis and a suffocating heat wave. And into this volatile atmosphere, another killer emerged, one who also craved the spotlight. He targeted young women with long, dark hair and couples in parked cars, striking with a .44 caliber revolver. The press dubbed him the .44 caliber killer, but he would soon give himself a far more memorable name. David Berkowitz, a postal worker from Yonkers, began his killing spree, and like Rader, he couldn't resist the urge to communicate. He left letters at the crime scenes, bizarre, rambling notes addressed to the police. In April 1977, after murdering a young couple, he left a letter addressed to NYPD Captain Joseph Borelli. It was in this letter that he first signed off with the name that would terrorize the city, Son of Sam. He then took his game to a new level, writing directly to the press. He sent a letter to the prominent New York Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin, a move that guaranteed his words would be plastered across the front pages. The letter was a chilling mix of taunts, threats, and cryptic references. It fueled a media frenzy and a public panic unlike anything the city had ever seen. Berkowitz was no longer just a killer, he was a dark celebrity, his terrifying persona amplified by the very newspapers he was communicating with. His letters provided invaluable insight for police profilers, painting a picture of a paranoid, lonely individual who felt powerless in his daily life and sought a sense of godlike control through his crimes and the fear they generated. The communications themselves were a critical mistake, revealing his psychological state and his desperate need for attention. However, his ultimate capture would come not from a linguistic analysis of his letters, but from a mistake so mundane, so ordinary, it almost defies belief. On the night of July 31, 1977, Berkowitz carried out his final attack in Brooklyn, killing Stacy Moskowitz and blinding her date, Robert Violante. As the chaos of the shooting unfolded, a local resident named Cecilia Davis was out walking her dog. She recalled seeing a man get into a cream-colored Ford Galaxy that had been parked awkwardly near a fire hydrant. She also remembered seeing patrol officers ticketing the car shortly before the shooting. This small detail, the memory of a parking ticket, was the thread that would unravel the entire Son of Sam mystery. When Detective James Justice from the Omega Task Force, assigned to hunt the killer, heard Davis's account, he recognized its potential significance. He ordered a canvass of every parking ticket issued in the area that night. It was a painstaking needle-in-a-haystack search, but it led them to a 1970 Ford Galaxy registered to one David Berkowitz of Yonkers. When detectives from the Yonkers Police Department investigated, they learned that Berkowitz, a postal employee, was a loner who had been the subject of complaints from a neighbor about his dog. In fact, the neighbor, Sam Carr, was the owner of a black Labrador retriever named Harvey. This detail was chillingly significant. In his letters, Berkowitz had claimed he was taking orders from a demonic entity channeled through his neighbor Sam's dog. The pieces were falling into place. On August 10, 1977, as Berkowitz left his apartment and got into his car, detectives surrounded him. In a bag on the seat next to him was the .44 caliber Bulldog revolver that had been used in the shootings. When asked who he was, he reportedly smiled and said, "I'm Sam." David Berkowitz, the man who held a city of 8 million people hostage with his taunts and his terror, was caught because of a $5 parking ticket. His grand, terrifying narrative was undone by the most banal of urban annoyances. Sometimes the most devastating mistake a killer can make is not an action, but an omission. It is the failure to complete the task, the failure to ensure that their dark work leaves no one behind to tell the tale. The survival of a victim is often the single most important factor in a serial killer's capture. A living, breathing piece of evidence that can look investigators in the eye and describe the face of evil. A live witness shatters the killer's illusion of control and provides law enforcement with their most powerful weapon, a first-hand account. Few killers have been more mythologized for their intelligence and charm than Ted Bundy. In the 1970s, he cut a bloody swath across the United States, from Washington and Utah to Colorado and Florida. He was educated, handsome, and articulate, a man who could easily win the trust of his victims. He was the very embodiment of the wolf in sheep's clothing, and he used his disarming appearance to lure dozens of young women to their deaths. He was meticulous, and for a long time, he seemed untouchable. But for all his cunning, Ted Bundy made the critical mistake of leaving a witness. On November 8, 1974, at a shopping mall in Murray, Utah, a young woman named Carol Durant was approached by a man posing as a police officer. He told her that someone had tried to break into her car and that she needed to come with him to the station to file a report. He was convincing, and he had a police badge. Durant, though hesitant, complied. Once in his Volkswagen Beetle, the man's demeanor changed. He tried to handcuff her, and when she resisted, a violent struggle ensued. Durant fought for her life with ferocious determination. She managed to get the car door open and throw herself out of the moving vehicle, screaming for help. Her attacker, stunned by her resistance, sped away. That man was Ted Bundy. And in that moment of frantic escape, Carol Durant became his greatest mistake. She was able to provide police with a wealth of invaluable information. She gave a detailed physical description of her attacker. She described his car, a light-colored VW Beetle, a detail that would come up again and again in reports of missing women. And most importantly, she could identify him. Her testimony was the first solid, direct link between a known individual and the string of disappearances and murders that had been plaguing the region. When Bundy was later arrested during a routine traffic stop in August 1975, another mundane mistake we will explore later, and police found handcuffs and other suspicious items in his car, it was Carol Durant who was called to a police lineup. Without hesitation, she picked Ted Bundy out of the lineup as the man who had abducted her. Her courage and her clear memory provided the evidence needed to secure his first major conviction for aggravated kidnapping. This conviction was the beginning of the end for Bundy. It put him in the system, it put his face on the news, and it shattered his anonymity. Though he would later escape and kill again in Florida, it was Carol Durant's survival that first pulled him from the shadows and exposed the monster behind the charming facade. 17 years later, in a different city, another notorious killer's reign of terror would come to an end for the exact same reason. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer had been quietly carrying out some of the most gruesome crimes imaginable. He lured young men to his apartment, where he drugged, murdered, and dismembered them, engaging in acts of cannibalism and necrophilia. He was a predator who operated in plain sight, his crimes going undetected for years. On the night of July 22, 1991, Dahmer brought a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards back to his apartment. As he had done with so many others, Dahmer attempted to subdue Edwards, placing a handcuff on one of his wrists and holding a knife to his chest. He told Edwards he was going to eat his heart. But unlike Dahmer's previous victims who had been drugged into submission, Edwards was still lucid and terrified. He saw his chance and he took it. Feigning compliance, Edwards waited for a moment of distraction. As Dahmer's attention wavered, Edwards struck him and bolted for the door. He ran out of the apartment and into the street, a single handcuff dangling from his wrist. He flagged down a passing police car and, in a state of panic, told the officers a weirdo had pulled a knife on him and handcuffed him in his apartment. He led the officers back to the Oxford apartments, back to apartment 213. When the officers entered Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, they were immediately struck by a foul, overpowering odor. As they looked around, one of the officers opened the door to Dahmer's refrigerator. Inside, he found a freshly severed human head. The horror was just beginning. A subsequent search of the apartment revealed a scene of unimaginable depravity. Skulls in a closet, human hearts and other organs in the freezer, torsos dissolving in a vat of acid, and numerous Polaroid photographs documenting the dismemberment of his victims. Tracy Edwards' escape did more than just save his own life. It blew the lid off a secret house of horrors. Without his survival, without his desperate flight to freedom, there is no telling how much longer Jeffrey Dahmer would have continued to kill. He was a quiet, unassuming man who had learned how to exploit the vulnerabilities of his community. But he underestimated the will to survive. In allowing Tracy Edwards to escape, Dahmer made his final and most catastrophic mistake. The live witness was the key that unlocked the door to his hidden world of death and depravity. For some killers, the act of murder is a performance, and every performance needs a souvenir. The psychological compulsion to take trophies from their victims is a well-documented, if deeply disturbing trait among many serial offenders. These objects, a piece of jewelry, a driver's license, a lock of hair, or in the most gruesome cases, a body part, serve as tangible mementos of their power and control. They allow the killer to relive the crime, to savor the moment of ultimate dominance long after the victim is gone. But these trophies, these prized possessions, also serve another purpose. They are direct physical links to the crime. They are pieces of damning evidence that, if discovered, can send their collector to prison for life. We have already seen how Jeffrey Dahmer's collection of Polaroid pictures and human remains provided irrefutable proof of his crimes. The photos were a particularly egregious error. They were a step-by-step documentation of his ghastly work, a visual diary of his descent into monstrousness. When police found them, there was no need for a confession. The pictures told the entire story, in graphic, horrifying detail. His need to preserve the memory of his acts was the very thing that ensured he would be held accountable for them. But Dahmer was not alone in this fatal habit. Halfway across the continent, in the vast, rugged wilderness of Alaska, another killer was amassing his own collection of trophies. Robert Hansen was a baker, a respected local business owner, and an accomplished hunter. He was also a prolific serial killer who, during the 1970s and early 1980s, abducted, raped, and murdered at least 17 young women. His method was particularly sadistic. He would fly his victims to remote locations in the Alaskan bush and then hunt them like wild game. For years, Hansen operated with impunity. The harsh Alaskan wilderness was his accomplice, swallowing his victims without a trace. But like so many others, Hansen had a weakness for souvenirs. In the attic of his comfortable suburban home, he kept a chilling collection of items belonging to the women he had murdered. He had their jewelry, their driver's licenses, and other personal effects. These were his trophies, physical reminders of his conquests. Even more damning, Hansen kept a map. In his den, he had an aviation chart of the surrounding wilderness. On this map, he had marked a series of small X's. Each X corresponded to the location where he had buried one of his victims. It was a treasure map of death, a personal record of his secret life. This map, kept in his own home, was an act of incredible arrogance and recklessness. He believed his sanctuary was impenetrable, that no one would ever discover his hidden archive of murder. His downfall began when a 17-year-old woman he had abducted managed to escape. Her testimony, combined with the work of dedicated Alaska State troopers, eventually led investigators to suspect the unassuming baker. In 1983, they obtained a search warrant for Robert Hansen's home. In the attic, they found the jewelry and IDs. And in his den, they found the map. The X's on the map corresponded to the locations where the bodies of his missing victims would later be found. The trophies and the map were the cornerstone of the case against him. Hansen, the great hunter, was ultimately ensnared by the very traps he had set for himself. This need to possess a piece of the victim speaks to a profound emptiness within the killer. The trophy is an attempt to fill that void, to hold on to a moment of perceived power in a life that is otherwise defined by feelings of inadequacy. But in doing so, they violate a cardinal rule of committing any crime: do not keep the evidence. It is a mistake born not of intellectual failure, but of a deep psychological sickness, a compulsion that overrides all logic and self-preservation. It is a fatal flaw rooted in the very pathology that drives them to kill in the first place. While some mistakes are born from grand gestures of ego, others are far more subtle, woven into the very fabric of the killer's methodology. Many serial killers, despite their desire to be seen as unpredictable forces of chaos, are creatures of habit. They operate within what criminal profilers call a comfort zone, a geographic area they know intimately. This area, often near their home or workplace, provides them with a sense of security and control. They know the escape routes, the quiet spots, the places where they are least likely to be disturbed. This reliance on a comfort zone, however, creates a double-edged sword. While it serves the killer's needs, it also creates a pattern, a series of geographic data points that can be plotted on a map. When multiple bodies are found within a specific area, or when victims fitting a similar profile all disappear from the same few neighborhoods, it gives investigators a powerful tool. They can begin to draw a circle, to narrow down the vast landscape of a city or state to a manageable search area. The killer's sanctuary becomes the blueprint for their own capture. This concept of geographic profiling was instrumental in the hunt for many killers. In the case of the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, who murdered dozens of women in Washington state, the locations where he disposed of his victims' bodies were clustered around the Green River and near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. This pattern suggested the killer had intimate knowledge of the area, that he likely lived or worked nearby. While it didn't lead directly to his identification at the time, it helped focus the investigation and build a profile of the type of person they were looking for, a local man familiar with the secluded, wooded areas south of Seattle. Similarly, the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, who terrorized the north of England in the late 1970s, focused his attacks in the red light districts of cities like Leeds and Bradford. This predictable hunting ground, while providing him with a steady supply of vulnerable victims, also allowed law enforcement to concentrate their resources and surveillance efforts. The pattern becomes a signature, and while the killer may believe it is a symbol of their dominance, it is in fact a breadcrumb trail leading back to their door. This predictability extends beyond just geography. Killers often adhere to a strict victimology, targeting individuals of a specific age, race, gender, or profession. Ted Bundy targeted young women with long dark hair parted in the middle. John Wayne Gacy targeted teenage boys and young men. This specificity, this adherence to a type, helps the killer fulfill a particular fantasy. But it also helps investigators link cases that might otherwise seem unrelated. When a pattern emerges in the victims, police know they are not dealing with a series of isolated incidents, but with a single, repeat offender. The modus operandi, or MO, the consistent method a killer uses to commit their crimes, is another form of this dangerous predictability. The use of the same type of weapon, the same type of ligatures, the same method of entry into a home. All of these repeated behaviors, while refined for efficiency by the killer, become calling cards for investigators. The MO can help link a new crime to an existing series, and it can reveal clues about the killer's skills, profession, or background. The killer's comfort zone, their preferred victim, their trusted MO, these are all elements of a ritual. And ritual, by its very nature, is repetitive and predictable. The very habits that give the killer a sense of power and control are the same habits that make them vulnerable. They create a discernible pattern in the chaos, a signal in the noise. And for the patient, methodical investigator, that pattern is the key. The killer's greatest strength, their consistency, ultimately becomes their greatest weakness. We often imagine the capture of a serial killer as the dramatic climax of a tense, high-stakes investigation. A brilliant detective connects the dots, a SWAT team raids a secluded cabin, and a dramatic confrontation ensues. But the reality is often far more mundane, almost anticlimactic. Some of the most dangerous and prolific murderers in history have been brought down not by a complex investigative strategy, but by the flashing red and blue lights of a routine traffic stop. It is a mistake of incredible simplicity. Getting caught for breaking a minor law while in the process of committing or concealing a far greater one. No case illustrates this point more starkly than that of Ted Bundy. We've already seen how his first major conviction came from the testimony of an escaped victim, Carol Durant. But the event that led to him being in that police lineup was in itself a stroke of luck for law enforcement. In the early morning hours of August 16, 1975, Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward was patrolling a suburb of Salt Lake City. He spotted a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly through a residential neighborhood and then speeding away as his patrol car approached. It was suspicious behavior. Hayward pulled the car over. The driver was the clean-cut, handsome Ted Bundy. When Hayward searched the car, he found a collection of items that were deeply unsettling. A ski mask, a crowbar, rope, handcuffs, and an ice pick. Bundy tried to explain them away as ordinary tools, but the combination was too sinister to ignore. He was arrested for evading a police officer and possession of burglary tools. This arrest is what put him on the radar of detectives investigating the disappearance of several young women in the area. It was this arrest that led to Carol Durant identifying him in the lineup. Bundy's relationship with traffic violations would continue to be his undoing. After being convicted of kidnapping, he was extradited to Colorado to face murder charges. In a daring move, he escaped from custody not once but twice. After his second escape in December 1977, he made his way to Florida, where he committed his final horrific series of attacks, including the brutal murders at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. He was on the run, one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. Yet, his final capture came down to another simple mistake behind the wheel. On February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, Florida, a police officer named David Lee spotted an orange Volkswagen Beetle weaving in the early morning hours. He ran the license plate and it came back as stolen. Officer Lee pulled the car over. The driver was Ted Bundy. A struggle ensued, but Bundy was finally apprehended for good. The man who had outsmarted and eluded law enforcement across multiple states, the man who had escaped from a courthouse law library and a county jail, was ultimately caught because he was driving a stolen car and couldn't stay in his lane. His reign of terror, which spanned a decade and cost at least 30 young women their lives, was ended by a vigilant patrol officer noticing a suspicious vehicle. It is a humbling reminder that for all their perceived brilliance, these killers are subject to the same simple rules and the same simple mistakes as anyone else. And Bundy is not an isolated case. Randy Kraft, known as the scorecard killer for the cryptic, coded list of victims he kept, is believed to have murdered as many as 67 young men in California, Oregon, and Michigan. His nearly 15-year killing spree came to an abrupt end on May 14, 1983. Two California Highway Patrol officers noticed a Toyota Celica weaving erratically on the San Diego freeway. They pulled the car over for a suspected DUI. The driver was Randy Kraft. In the passenger seat, slumped over, was a young Marine. The officers initially thought he was passed out, but they soon realized he was dead. He had been drugged and strangled. A search of Kraft's trunk revealed a collection of photographs of his victims and the infamous scorecard, his coded ledger of murder. He was arrested on the spot. A routine stop for drunk driving brought down one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in American history. These cases highlight a fundamental truth. The commission of heinous crimes does not grant immunity from minor ones. The focus and mental energy required to be a serial killer, to stalk, abduct, murder, and dispose of bodies, can lead to a surprising lack of attention to the mundane details of daily life, like obeying traffic laws. This carelessness, this belief that they are above such petty concerns, has repeatedly proven to be a fatal miscalculation. The flashing lights in the rearview mirror have, for many of these predators, been the first signal that their dark journey was finally over. Just as the beginning of a crime is fraught with risk, so too is the end. The disposal of a body is one of the most challenging and dangerous parts of a murder. It is a moment of high anxiety, where the killer is in possession of the ultimate piece of evidence and must find a way to make it disappear forever. A desperate or careless attempt to get rid of human remains has been the direct cause of capture for several killers, sometimes in ways that are almost grotesquely absurd. The act of concealment becomes an act of revelation. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a quiet, unassuming civil servant named Dennis Nilsen was living in London. To his colleagues and neighbors, he was a solitary but unremarkable man. But behind the closed doors of his apartments, first at 195 Melrose Avenue and later at 23 Cranley Gardens, Nilsen was carrying out a series of horrific murders. He would lure young men, often homeless or marginalized, back to his home, where he would strangle them. But after the murder, Nilsen faced a problem: what to do with the bodies. Living in a small London flat, he had no easy way to transport and bury his victims. So he developed a gruesome routine. He would dismember the bodies in his bathtub, boil the flesh off the bones to reduce the smell, and then attempt to dispose of the remains in the most mundane way imaginable, by flushing them down the toilet. For a time, this horrifying system worked. But in early 1983, at his Cranley Gardens apartment, the system failed. The small, fleshy pieces of his victims began to clog the building's plumbing. Nilsen and his neighbors started experiencing problems with their drains. They called a plumber. On February 8, 1983, a drainage specialist from a company called Dino-Rod arrived to investigate the blockage. When he opened a drain cover at the side of the house, he made a sickening discovery. The pipe was packed with a gray, fleshy substance and small bones that were unmistakably human. He immediately called the police. When detectives arrived and questioned the residents, Dennis Nilsen, feigning surprise, asked, "Good heavens, what have you found?" When a detective told him it looked like human flesh, Nilsen's composure finally broke. He knew the game was up. He calmly confessed, telling the officers that the remains of 2 or 3 bodies were likely in his apartment. He then led them to plastic bags containing more human remains and directed them to a wardrobe where he had stored 2 severed heads. Dennis Nilsen, a killer who had murdered at least 12 young men, was caught because he tried to flush his victims down the toilet. His downfall was not the result of a long, complex investigation, but of a simple plumbing problem. His attempt to make his victims vanish in the most ordinary way possible backfired spectacularly, bringing his hidden world of murder into the open. The very pipes that were meant to carry away his secrets instead delivered them directly to the authorities. This theme of unwise disposal leading to discovery is not unique. In another bizarre case from London, decades earlier, the killer John Christie made an even more baffling error. Christie murdered at least 8 people, including his own wife, in his ground-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place. He hid the bodies under the floorboards, in a sealed-off kitchen alcove, and buried in the small garden outside. In March 1953, with his apartment filled with the decomposing remains of his victims, Christie moved out. In an act of astounding recklessness, he then illegally sublet the flat to another man. He simply packed his bags and left, leaving his gruesome secret sealed within the walls. The new tenant, Beresford Brown, was given permission by the landlord to use the kitchen. When Brown went to install a shelf, he knocked on a wall and noticed it sounded hollow. He tore away the wallpaper and the plasterboard behind it, revealing a small, dark alcove. Inside, he found the bodies of 3 of John Christie's victims. A further search of the property by police uncovered more remains, including those of Christie's wife under the floorboards. Christie, who had been on the run, was quickly apprehended. His decision to simply abandon his crime scene, to leave his victims entombed in a home he knew would soon be occupied by others, was an act of almost incomprehensible carelessness. He treated his house of horrors like a storage unit he no longer needed. And this casual disregard for the evidence he left behind led directly to his capture and execution. These cases serve as a stark reminder that the crime is not over when the victim's life ends. The aftermath, the cleanup, the concealment, these are all stages fraught with peril for the killer. A moment of panic, a lazy shortcut, or a fundamentally flawed plan for disposal can undo all the meticulous planning that may have gone into the crime itself. The dead have a way of speaking, and sometimes they do so through a clogged drain or a hollow wall. In the modern age, the physical world and the digital world are inextricably linked. Nearly every action we take, from making a phone call to buying a coffee, leaves a digital footprint, a trail of data that can be followed, analyzed, and used to reconstruct our movements and activities. For a serial killer, this interconnected world presents a minefield of new opportunities to make a mistake. What might have been a relatively low-risk action in the past, such as using a victim's cash, is now a high-risk blunder when it involves a credit or debit card. Israel Keyes was a different kind of serial killer. He was a terrifyingly organized and disciplined predator who operated across the United States for over a decade. He had no discernible victim type and no geographic pattern. He would fly to a city, rent a car, and drive hundreds or thousands of miles to commit a murder, often using kill kits he had buried years in advance. He was meticulous, patient, and left almost no evidence behind. He is believed to be responsible for up to 11 murders, though the true number may never be known. For years, he was a ghost, his crimes so random and geographically dispersed that they were never connected. But in 2012, this master of anonymity made a simple, fatal error. On February 1, 2012, he abducted an 18-year-old barista named Samantha Koenig from her coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. He murdered her, and then, before disposing of her body in a frozen lake, he took her debit card. After the murder, Keyes embarked on a 2-week cruise. When he returned, he began using Samantha Koenig's debit card. He made a series of small withdrawals from ATMs in Alaska, Arizona, New Mexico, and finally Texas. This was his mistake. In the pre-digital age, stealing cash was difficult to trace. But using a debit card in 2012 was like sending up a flare. Every transaction was a digital breadcrumb, time-stamped and geolocated. Law enforcement, who were desperately searching for Koenig, were monitoring her bank accounts. When the first transaction appeared, they had their first real lead. They quickly obtained the surveillance footage from the ATM. While Keyes was disguised in a hoodie, the footage provided crucial information. They could see the type of car he was driving. As he continued to use the card across the country, a clear path of his journey emerged. Police and the FBI were able to track his movements in near real time. On March 13, 2012, in the parking lot of a Cotton Patch Cafe in Lufkin, Texas, a police officer spotted the white Ford Focus that had been identified from the ATM surveillance footage. The officer ran the plates, which came back registered to Israel Keyes. A tactical team moved in and arrested him. The man who had prided himself on his ability to remain invisible, to commit the perfect, untraceable crime, was caught because he wanted a few $100s from his victim's bank account. In his subsequent interrogations, Keyes confessed to a string of murders, shocking investigators with the scope and cold-blooded efficiency of his crimes. He was a killer who had studied the methods of others, who understood forensic evidence and how to avoid leaving it. He went to extraordinary lengths to maintain his anonymity. But in the end, he was brought down by the most basic of modern investigative tools, tracking electronic transactions. His desire for a small financial gain completely overrode his otherwise disciplined approach to self-preservation. It was a foolish, amateurish mistake from a man who considered himself a professional. This type of error is not unique to Keyes. Aileen Wuornos, the rare female serial killer who murdered 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990, also made the mistake of getting entangled with her victims' possessions. She and her lover, Tyria Moore, were involved in a minor car accident while driving a vehicle that belonged to one of Wuornos's victims. They fled the scene, but the abandoned car provided a crucial piece of evidence. Wuornos's fingerprints were lifted from the vehicle and matched to prints already in the police database from a prior arrest. In the digital age, the margin for error for killers has shrunk dramatically. The use of a victim's cell phone can pinpoint a suspect's location via cell tower triangulation. The use of their credit card creates an immediate and traceable record. The digital ghost of the victim becomes a powerful tool for investigators, their electronic life continuing to provide clues long after their physical life has ended. For the modern killer, the temptation to use these items is a siren song leading directly to the rocks of their own capture. Serial murder is typically a solitary endeavor. The killer operates alone, shrouded in a secrecy that is essential for their survival. Bringing another person into that dark world, creating an accomplice, is a monumental risk. It doubles the potential for mistakes, for careless words, for a crisis of conscience. A partnership in murder is inherently unstable, built on a foundation of shared guilt and paranoia. The bond can easily fracture under the pressure of an investigation, with one partner choosing to save themselves by betraying the other. While rare, the involvement of an accomplice has been the undoing of several killers. We return to the case of Aileen Wuornos. While she was the one who pulled the trigger, her girlfriend, Tyria Moore, was deeply entangled in her life during the killing spree. Moore was not a direct participant in the murders, but she was aware of Wuornos's violent activities and benefited from the money and items Wuornos stole from her victims. When the investigation began to close in, this relationship became Wuornos's greatest liability. After Wuornos's fingerprint was identified from the victim's abandoned car, police knew who they were looking for. They also knew about her close relationship with Tyria Moore. They tracked Moore down and approached her. Faced with the possibility of being charged as an accessory to murder, Moore chose to cooperate. She agreed to work with the police to elicit a confession from Wuornos. In a series of secretly recorded phone calls, Moore, guided by investigators, pleaded with Wuornos to turn herself in, to clear her name. In these conversations, Wuornos made a series of incriminating statements, trying to protect Moore while implicitly admitting her own guilt. These recorded calls, filled with raw emotion and desperation, became a powerful piece of evidence against her. Moore's cooperation provided the final push that led to Wuornos's arrest and subsequent confession. The loyalty Wuornos believed she had was an illusion. The person she had trusted, the person she had killed for, was the one who sealed her fate. Even in cases where accomplices are more actively involved, the risk of betrayal remains. In the late 19th century, H. Holmes, one of America's first documented serial killers, operated a murder castle in Chicago, a hotel filled with secret passages, gas chambers, and a crematorium. He was a con artist and a swindler as well as a killer, and his crimes often involved complex insurance fraud schemes. One such scheme involved a man named Benjamin Pitzel. Holmes convinced Pitzel to fake his own death so they could split the life insurance money. Holmes, however, had no intention of splitting the money. He murdered Pitzel for real, and then, to eliminate witnesses, he went on to murder 3 of Pitzel's children. For this part of his plan, he enlisted the help of an accomplice, a man who had helped him build the murder castle. But when Holmes failed to deliver a promised payout to his co-conspirator, the man went to the police. His testimony unraveled Holmes's web of deceit and murder, leading to his arrest and eventual execution. A simple financial dispute between criminals brought down a man who had built an entire factory of death. Involving another person in such monstrous acts fundamentally changes the dynamic of the crime. It introduces an element of unpredictability, another human being with their own fears, desires, and capacity for self-preservation. The secret is no longer the sole property of the killer. It is a shared burden. And under the immense pressure of a police investigation, that burden often becomes too heavy for one of the parties to bear. The partnership dissolves and the secret comes out. It is a classic example of the prisoner's dilemma, where the most rational choice for the individual is to betray their partner. For a serial killer, trust is a luxury they cannot afford, and placing it in an accomplice is a gamble that rarely pays off. Every serial killer leaves a signature, a unique behavioral fingerprint that sets their crimes apart. This signature is not to be confused with the modus operandi. It is not what the killer does to commit the crime, but rather what they do to fulfill a psychological need. It can be a specific form of mutilation, a ritualistic arrangement of the body, or something left at the scene. While this signature helps investigators link cases, it can also, in some instances, take the form of a physical mark that leads directly back to the killer's own body. A bite mark, a gruesome and intimate form of assault, can become as unique and damning as a fingerprint. Ted Bundy, a man whose mistakes we have revisited several times, provides the most famous and forensically significant example of this. After his second escape from custody in Colorado, Bundy made his way to Tallahassee, Florida. In the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In a frenzied, 15-minute rampage, he bludgeoned 4 young women, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. The crime scene was one of horrific violence. But on the body of Lisa Levy, he had left something else. He had bitten her deeply on her buttock. At the time, the evidentiary value of this might have seemed secondary to the other, more obvious injuries. But as the investigation progressed and Bundy was eventually captured, that bite mark would become the linchpin of the prosecution's case. Forensic odontology, the study of dental evidence, was a developing field at the time. The prosecution brought in a forensic odontologist named Dr. Richard Souvirin. He took dental impressions from Ted Bundy and then created a photographic overlay to compare the unique characteristics of Bundy's teeth, their alignment, chips, and malformations with the photograph of the bite mark left on Lisa Levy's body. The match was undeniable. In a moment of high courtroom drama, Dr. Souvirin presented his findings to the jury. Using a large photographic blow-up, he demonstrated point by point how Bundy's crooked and chipped teeth aligned perfectly with the marks on the victim. He famously concluded his testimony by saying, "I've never seen a case where all the marks were so clear." It was the only piece of direct physical evidence linking Bundy to the Chi Omega murders. There were no fingerprints, no other DNA. There was only the savage imprint of his own teeth. This evidence was devastating. It was an intimate, personal signature that he could not deny or explain away. The jury was convinced. They found Ted Bundy guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to death. The bite mark, an act of pure rage and dominance, a way of literally leaving his mark on his victim, became the very thing that sealed his fate. He had, in effect, signed his own death warrant with his teeth. His psychological need to inflict this final, personal indignity overrode any sense of forensic awareness he may have possessed. While less common than DNA or fingerprints, bite mark evidence has played a role in other cases as well. It represents a unique intersection of the killer's psychological signature and physical evidence. It is a mistake born from the heat of the moment, an impulsive act of violence that leaves behind a permanent, measurable, and identifiable record. It is a reminder that in their frenzy, killers can inadvertently leave pieces of themselves behind, not just microscopic cells, but the very shape and structure of their own bodies, imprinted on their victims as a lasting testament to their guilt. Many serial killers lead compartmentalized lives. They are husbands, fathers, employees, and neighbors. They maintain a facade of normality that conceals the monstrous reality of their secret activities. This double life often involves other, more minor forms of criminality, theft, fraud, or parole violations. It is a common misconception that these individuals are solely focused on murder. In reality, their pathology often manifests in a broader pattern of antisocial behavior. And sometimes it is an arrest for one of these lesser, unrelated crimes that inadvertently brings their entire hidden world crashing down. Danny Rolling, who would become known as the Gainesville Ripper, terrorized the university town of Gainesville, Florida in August 1990. Over the course of just 4 days, he murdered 5 college students in their off-campus apartments, leaving behind gruesome, ritualistically posed crime scenes that created a wave of panic and fear. The killer was a ghost, leaving little evidence and no witnesses. As the massive investigation into the student murders was underway, Danny Rolling was miles away, continuing his criminal career. He was a drifter with a long rap sheet for robbery. On September 7th, just days after the Gainesville murders, Rolling was arrested in Ocala, Florida, for robbing a supermarket. It was a routine arrest for a common crime, and at the time, police had no reason to connect this bungling robber to the sophisticated and sadistic killer they were hunting in Gainesville. Rolling was convicted of the robbery and sentenced to life in prison as a habitual offender. For a time, it seemed the Gainesville Ripper case would go cold, but investigators were meticulous. They had recovered evidence from the murder scenes, including blood and semen, and they had a general profile of their suspect. As they continued to work through leads, they began to look at violent criminals who were active in the state at the time of the murders. Their attention eventually turned to the recently incarcerated Danny Rolling. His history of violence and burglary made him a person of interest. Investigators obtained a sample of his blood and sent it to the lab for comparison with the evidence from the Gainesville crime scenes. The DNA results came back as a perfect match. The man sitting in a prison cell for robbing a grocery store was the same man who had committed one of the most infamous killing sprees in Florida's history. His arrest for robbery was a stroke of incredible luck for the investigation. It took a violent and dangerous predator off the streets, effectively ending his killing spree. It also placed him in a controlled environment where his DNA could be easily obtained and compared to the evidence. Had he not been caught for that robbery, it's possible he would have continued to kill, and the Gainesville case might have remained unsolved for much longer. The small, desperate crime was the key that unlocked the much larger, more monstrous one. This phenomenon is surprisingly common. Serial killers often have extensive criminal histories that predate their first murder. Their lives are frequently chaotic, marked by a pattern of escalating criminal behavior. An arrest for any one of these activities can be the lucky break that investigators need. It might be a parole violation that allows officers to search a suspect's home, uncovering incriminating evidence. It might be a DUI arrest where a weapon is found in the car. Or it might be a simple theft that puts the suspect's fingerprints and DNA into a database, where it can later be matched to a cold case. The killer's focus is on evading capture for the ultimate crime of murder. They may become so consumed with the planning and execution of their killings that they grow careless in other aspects of their criminal life. This lack of focus, this inability to maintain discipline across all their illegal activities creates a vulnerability. The legal system, in a way, casts a wide net, and sometimes in catching a small fish, it inadvertently lands a shark. The mind of a serial killer is a landscape of dark and powerful compulsions. One of the most perplexing and self-destructive of these is the urge to return to the scene of the crime. This behavior, often romanticized in fiction, has a very real psychological basis. The killer may be drawn back to relive the thrill of the murder, to savor the feeling of power and control they experienced in that location. They may be checking to see if the body has been discovered, or they may be there simply to feel close to their victim one last time. Whatever the reason, this pilgrimage to their own dark handiwork is an act of immense risk, placing them in the one location on Earth where they are most vulnerable to being observed or captured. Arthur Shawcross, the Genesee River Killer, was a predator who hunted in and around Rochester, New York between 1988 and 1989. After serving time for the manslaughter of 2 children, he was paroled and began a new killing spree, murdering at least 12 women. His victims were primarily sex workers, whom he would strangle and often mutilate, dumping their bodies near the Genesee River. As the body count rose, law enforcement formed a task force to hunt the killer. They began to conduct surveillance on the areas where the bodies had been found, hoping the killer might make the mistake of returning. It was a long shot, a strategy based on psychological profiling rather than hard evidence, but it was one of the few avenues they had. In the winter of 1989, their patience paid off. A police helicopter was conducting aerial surveillance over a bridge that spanned the Genesee River, an area near where one of Shawcross's victims had recently been discovered. The helicopter crew spotted a man standing on the bridge, looking down at the water. He was urinating off the side of the bridge. This act, while minor, was enough to draw their attention in a secluded area. They continued to observe him. The man, Arthur Shawcross, then got back in his car and drove away. The surveillance team on the ground followed him. The next day, the body of his final victim was found in the water directly below the spot on the bridge where Shawcross had been standing. He had just disposed of her body and had lingered at the scene. His need to stay, to watch, to perhaps savor his final moments of control had placed him directly in the sights of the police. This observation gave investigators the probable cause they needed. They closed in on Shawcross, and during a lengthy interrogation, he confessed to the murders. The helicopter surveillance was the critical turning point. Without it, he might have driven away unnoticed, free to kill again. His psychological need to revisit the site of his crime, a compulsion he could not control, proved to be his undoing. He was literally caught in the act of admiring his own work. This compulsion is rooted in the same narcissistic and fantasy-driven mindset that fuels the murders themselves. The crime scene is a stage, and the murder is the killer's grand performance. Returning to it is like an actor returning to an empty theater, to stand on the stage and relive the applause. For the killer, the applause is the memory of the victim's fear and their own sense of omnipotence. But in doing so, they risk an audience they did not anticipate, the police. It is a gamble of psychological gratification against the risk of capture. And for killers like Arthur Shawcross, it is a gamble they ultimately lose. For some serial offenders, the impulses that drive them to kill are part of a larger constellation of deviant behaviors. Their crimes are not limited to murder, but can also include lesser offenses like public indecency, voyeurism, or soliciting sex workers. These activities, while not as severe as murder, still carry the risk of attracting law enforcement attention. A chance encounter with a patrol officer during one of these minor transgressions can inadvertently expose the far more sinister secrets the killer is hiding. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, cast a long shadow of fear across northern England for 5 years, from 1975 to 1980. He murdered 13 women and attacked at least 7 others, primarily targeting sex workers in the industrial cities of Yorkshire. The hunt for the Ripper was one of the largest and most complex police investigations in British history, but it was also plagued by mistakes and missed opportunities. Sutcliffe was interviewed by police a total of 9 times during the investigation, but was always discounted as a suspect. He seemed to lead a charmed life, slipping through the cracks of the massive manhunt time and again. His eventual capture, in January 1981, was not the result of a brilliant investigative breakthrough in the murder case. Instead, it was the result of a routine police patrol and a suspicious car. On the night of January 2, 1981, 2 police officers in Sheffield were patrolling an industrial area known for being a spot for sex workers. They spotted a Rover car parked in the driveway of a well-lit building. Inside were a man and a woman. The officers decided to investigate. The man was Peter Sutcliffe, and the woman was a 24-year-old sex worker. But what truly aroused the officers' suspicion was the car's license plate. A quick check revealed that the plates were false. They belonged to a Skoda. Sutcliffe was arrested for having false plates. He was taken to the police station for what should have been a relatively minor charge. While at the station, Sutcliffe asked to use the toilet. He was discreetly followed by an officer who, after Sutcliffe returned, checked the cistern and discovered that the killer had tried to hide a knife. This discovery, combined with the false plates and the location of his arrest, elevated the suspicion around Sutcliffe. The officers also noticed that his physical appearance matched the description of the Yorkshire Ripper. They began to question him about the murders. At the same time, another officer, remembering that Sutcliffe had been a previous suspect, requested the Ripper case files. They discovered that Sutcliffe had been interviewed multiple times and that there were numerous pieces of evidence that pointed in his direction but had been overlooked. Faced with the mounting evidence and the pressure of the interrogation, Peter Sutcliffe finally confessed. He calmly described his 5-year campaign of murder in chilling detail. The man who had eluded one of the biggest police hunts in history was caught because he was in a car with false license plates while soliciting a sex worker. His compulsion to engage in this risky behavior in an area he knew was being patrolled was his fatal error. It was a mundane end to a monstrous reign of terror, a capture born from chance, suspicion, and a killer's inability to control all of his deviant impulses. This type of capture underscores the chaotic nature of many killers' lives. They are not always the cold, calculating planners of popular fiction. They are often driven by a storm of compulsions, and murder is just the most extreme manifestation. Their need for immediate gratification, whether sexual or otherwise, can lead them to take foolish risks that have nothing to do with their primary crimes. In the case of Peter Sutcliffe, this lack of discipline is what finally brought the Ripper Squad to his door. While many serial killers are driven by violent, pathological fantasies, some are motivated by a colder, more calculated impulse: greed. For these predators, murder is simply a means to a financial end. They kill for inheritance, for insurance money, or to cover up fraud. But the very act of trying to profit from a victim's death creates a paper trail, and any attempt to manipulate that trail, such as forging a document, can be a glaring mistake that unravels the entire scheme. Dr. Harold Shipman was, by all outward appearances, a beloved family doctor in the town of Hyde near Manchester, England. He was a pillar of the community, a trusted physician who had cared for generations of local families. But beneath this benevolent facade was one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Shipman's victims were his own patients, typically elderly women who lived alone. He would visit them at home, administer a lethal dose of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin, and then alter their medical records to indicate they had died of natural causes. For decades, he got away with it. As a doctor, he was the one who signed the death certificates, and his explanations were rarely questioned. He is believed to have murdered over 250 of his patients, a staggering number that went unnoticed for years due to the age and health of his victims. His killing spree was a quiet, methodical abuse of trust. His downfall, when it came, was not because of a medical discovery, but because of a simple, amateurish forgery. In June 1998, one of Shipman's patients, Kathleen Grundy, the former mayoress of Hyde, died suddenly. Shipman was the last person to see her alive, and he certified her death. But shortly after her death, a new will mysteriously appeared. This new will left Kathleen Grundy's entire estate worth nearly £400,000 to Dr. Harold Shipman and explicitly excluded her own children. Grundy's daughter, a solicitor named Angela Woodruff, was immediately suspicious. She knew her mother was not the type of person to disinherit her children. And when she examined the will itself, the red flags were impossible to ignore. The document was poorly typed, the The language was clumsy, and the signature looked forged. It was a shockingly amateurish document for a woman of her mother's standing. Woodruff refused to accept the will's authenticity and went to the police. This single act of suspicion, triggered by a crudely forged document, was the catalyst that brought Shipman's entire world of secret murder crashing down. The police launched an investigation, starting with the death of Kathleen Grundy. They exhumed her body, and a forensic analysis revealed that she had died from a massive overdose of diamorphine. This discovery opened the floodgates. Investigators began to look at the death certificate Shipman had signed for other elderly female patients. A pattern of alarming statistical anomalies emerged. His patients were dying at a far higher rate than those of other doctors, and they were often dying at home shortly after a visit from Shipman. Exhumations of other bodies confirmed the same pattern: lethal doses of opiates. Harold Shipman was arrested and eventually convicted for the murder of 15 of his patients, though authorities are certain the true number is in the hundreds. The man who had conducted a secret holocaust against the elderly in his care was brought down by his own greed. His meticulous medical forgeries had gone undetected for years, but his clumsy attempt at forging a will was a mistake born of pure avarice. He overestimated his own cleverness and underestimated the intelligence of his victim's family. The forged will was a piece of evidence that was not medical or forensic, but legal and financial, and it was the thread that, when pulled, unraveled his entire secret life. While the image of the lone wolf serial killer is pervasive, we have already discussed the risks of involving a direct accomplice. However, a killer can make a similar, though more subtle mistake, confiding in others. The psychological weight of carrying such dark secrets can be immense. The need to unburden oneself, to boast about one's cleverness, or simply to be truly seen by another person can lead a killer to drop their guard and confess, or at least hint at, their crimes to a friend, a family member, or even a cellmate. This act of confession, of sharing the secret, transfers the power from the killer to the confidant, who is then faced with a moral choice. In Vienna, Austria, during the 1980s, a group of 4 nurses' aides at the Linz General Hospital engaged in a horrifying killing spree. Waltraud Wagner, Irene Leidolf, Stefania Meyer, and Maria Gruber became known as the Linz Angels of Death. They murdered dozens of elderly patients whom they considered troublesome or simply a nuisance. Their method was insidious. They would either administer a lethal overdose of drugs or, in a particularly cruel technique, hold the patient's nose and pour water down their throat, effectively drowning them in their own beds. They operated for years, their crimes hidden within the daily cycle of life and death in a large hospital ward. The deaths of elderly, infirm patients were not in themselves suspicious. The 4 women felt invincible, protected by the very environment in which they committed their crimes. But their downfall came not from a medical investigation, but from their own loose tongues. Their shared secret created a bond, but also a sense of collective arrogance. One night in 1989, after a few drinks in a local tavern, one of the aides was overheard bragging about their activities. She was boasting about the most recent patient they had sent to God. A doctor at a nearby table heard the chilling confession and reported it to the police. The investigation that followed quickly unraveled the entire conspiracy. Faced with police questioning, the women turned on each other, each confessing and implicating the others. They admitted to their crimes, with the ringleader, Waltraud Wagner, claiming to have killed at least 49 patients. Their need to boast, to share the power they felt they held over life and death with an audience, was their undoing. The secret was too big, too intoxicating to keep to themselves. They made the fatal error of believing their confidence would be shared by an outsider, and it brought their entire murderous enterprise to an end. This need to confide can also be seen in more solitary killers. The psychological pressure can build until it becomes unbearable. They might drop hints to a spouse who notices a change in their behavior or discovers suspicious items. They might confess to a fellow inmate while incarcerated for another crime, hoping to gain status or respect in the prison hierarchy. Each of these scenarios represents a loss of control, a moment when the killer's internal world spills out into the external one. This mistake is fundamentally different from the arrogant taunting of killers like BTK. It is not about playing a game with the police. It is a more personal, more intimate failure. It is a breakdown of the discipline required to maintain a double life. It is a moment of human weakness, of needing connection or recognition that provides an unexpected pathway to justice. The confidant becomes the most powerful kind of witness, one who has heard the truth directly from the killer's own lips. The act of driving offers a peculiar kind of anonymity. Encased in steel and glass, we move through the world as semi-private observers. For a serial killer, a vehicle is an essential tool. For stalking victims, for abducting them, for transporting bodies, and for making a quick escape. But this reliance on a vehicle also creates a host of vulnerabilities. We've seen how traffic stops can be a killer's undoing, but even more basic issues, like the state of the car itself, can draw the unwanted attention of law enforcement. Joel Rifkin was a quiet, unemployed landscaper from Long Island, New York. Between 1989 and 1993, he murdered up to 17 women, many of whom were sex workers from New York City. He would pick them up, strangle them, and then dismember their bodies, scattering the remains across the tri-state area. For 4 years, he was a phantom, his crimes often not even linked together due to the disparate locations where the remains were found. His killing spree came to an end on June 28, 1993, because of a missing license plate. 2 New York State troopers were on patrol on the Southern State Parkway when they noticed a Mazda pickup truck driving without a rear plate. It was a minor, fixable violation, the kind that usually results in a simple ticket. They signaled for the truck to pull over. Instead of complying, the driver, Joel Rifkin, sped up. A high-speed chase ensued, with Rifkin leading police on a dangerous pursuit that ended only when he crashed into a utility pole. As the troopers approached the wrecked truck, they were hit by a horrifying, overpowering smell. They looked in the back of the truck, under a blue tarp, and found the decomposing body of his final victim, Tiffany Bresciani. In that moment, the mystery of the scattered body parts and the missing women began to resolve itself. Rifkin's decision to flee from a simple traffic stop was a massive red flag. His panic, his desperate attempt to escape, turned a routine check into a major incident. The missing license plate was the initial mistake, but the reckless flight from the police was what guaranteed his capture. A simple $5 part from an auto store could have allowed him to continue his journey and his killing spree unnoticed. This type of vehicle-related mistake is a recurring theme. In the case of the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, we noted that he was arrested in a car with false license plates. This discrepancy was a key factor that aroused the initial suspicion of the patrol officers. It was a deliberate act of deception that, ironically, drew more attention to him than if he had simply used his own plates. It suggested he had something to hide, which, of course, he did. These errors highlight the immense pressure a killer is under, especially in the aftermath of a crime, when they are often transporting a body or evidence. Their state of mind is agitated, their focus is on the monumental secret they are carrying, and their attention to small details can slip. They forget to check their taillights, they don't notice their registration is expired, or they make a foolish decision like using false plates or driving without one at all. For law enforcement, a vehicle is a rolling container of potential evidence. A traffic stop provides a legal gateway to observe the driver, to look inside the car, and, if probable cause exists, to conduct a search. The car is an extension of the killer's private domain, but it is one that moves through public space, subject to public laws. The failure to maintain the illusion of normality, to keep the vehicle in perfect, unremarkable order, can be the tiny crack in the facade that brings the whole structure down. Luring a victim is a moment of supreme risk for a serial killer. It is the point where their secret world must intersect with the public one. To get close to their target, they must often interact with them in a place where they could be seen. A witness who sees a killer with their victim shortly before the murder can provide a description, identify a vehicle, and establish a timeline that can be the crucial first step in an investigation. The killer's attempt to build trust can be the very act that betrays them. John Wayne Gacy was a man who understood the power of a trustworthy facade. In the 1970s, he was a successful contractor, a Democratic precinct captain, and a popular figure in his suburban Chicago community. He was famous for dressing up as Pogo the Clown to entertain children at local parties and hospitals. But this jolly, gregarious exterior concealed a sadistic predator who, over a 6-year period, murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men. Most of Gacy's victims were runaways or hustlers, young men whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed or vigorously investigated. He would lure them to his home with the promise of a job, a drink, or some marijuana. Once there, he would trick them into putting on handcuffs, claiming it was a magic trick before revealing his true intentions. He would then assault and strangle them, burying their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. For years, he operated with chilling efficiency, his respectable reputation providing the perfect cover. But in December 1978, he got careless. He approached a 15-year-old boy named Robert Peist at a local pharmacy where Peist worked. Gacy, who was there to discuss a remodeling job with the pharmacy owner, struck up a conversation with the boy. He offered Peist a job with his construction company, offering a much higher wage than he was making at the pharmacy. Peist was intrigued. On December 11, 1978, Robert Peist went to meet with Gacy to discuss the job offer. He told his mother where he was going and who he was meeting. He was never seen again. But unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert Peist was not a drifter. He was a good student from a stable, loving family. When he didn't come home, his parents immediately reported him missing, and they knew exactly who he was last seen with: a local contractor named John Wayne Gacy. This was Gacy's critical mistake. He broke his pattern of targeting marginalized youths and chose a victim with a strong support system. The police immediately focused their investigation on Gacy. He was placed under surveillance. When questioned, he was arrogant and deceptive, changing his story multiple times. The investigation quickly uncovered Gacy's prior conviction for sodomy, further raising suspicion. The link to Peist gave police the probable cause they needed to obtain a search warrant for Gacy's home. During the search, they found items belonging to other missing boys. But the most horrifying discovery came from a police officer who noticed a strange, sweet, decomposing smell emanating from a heating duct. The crawl space was excavated, and the remains of 29 of Gacy's victims were found, buried in lime and plastic sheeting. Robert Peist, Gacy's final victim, was later found in the Des Plaines River. The job offer, a seemingly innocuous interaction in a public place, was the act that brought down one of America's most prolific serial killers. Gacy's confidence had grown to the point of recklessness. He believed he was untouchable, that his community standing would protect him. But in targeting Robert Peist, he created a direct, traceable link between himself and a victim, a link that could not be explained away. The public act of luring his victim was the first step in his public unmasking. In the long history of criminal investigation, few breakthroughs have been as revolutionary as the use of fingerprints. The discovery in the 19th century that the unique ridge patterns on our fingertips remain unchanged throughout our lives provided law enforcement with a powerful and reliable method of identification. For decades, the fear of leaving behind a fingerprint was a primary concern for any criminal. For a serial killer, a single, misplaced print at a crime scene could be the invisible witness that would eventually speak their name. Before the advent of DNA, fingerprinting was the gold standard of forensic identification. A latent print, lifted from a surface with powder and tape, could be compared against the 10 print cards of known criminals, or used to link a suspect to a scene with near certainty. Many killers in the pre-DNA era were acutely aware of this, often taking measures like wearing gloves to avoid leaving prints. But in a violent, chaotic struggle, or a moment of carelessness, gloves can slip or a surface can be touched inadvertently. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, terrorized Southern California in the mid-1980s with a brutal spree of home invasion murders, rapes, and burglaries. His crimes were seemingly random, with a wide range of victim types and methods, which made him incredibly difficult to profile. He was a Satanist who left pentagrams at his crime scenes, a phantom who seemed to strike anywhere, at any time. His reign of terror came to an end because of a single fingerprint. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez attacked a couple in their home in Mission Viejo. After shooting the man and assaulting the woman, he stole their car, an orange Toyota station wagon. A witness, the couple's young son, saw Ramirez drive away. He had the presence of mind to note the car and reported it to the police. Days later, the stolen Toyota was found abandoned in a parking lot. The police forensics team descended on the vehicle, carefully dusting every surface for latent prints. On the rearview mirror, they found one, a single clear fingerprint. The print was rushed to California's new automated fingerprint identification system, AFIS, a computerized database that could compare a print against millions of others in a fraction of the time it would take a human examiner. The AFIS computer churned through its database and found a match. The print belonged to a 25-year-old drifter with a minor criminal record for traffic violations and drug possession, Richard Ramirez. For the first time, the Night Stalker had a name and a face. The police immediately released Ramirez's mugshot to the public. It was plastered on every television screen and on the front page of every newspaper in California. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez, unaware that he had been identified, took a bus to Los Angeles. When he entered a convenience store, he was recognized by a group of elderly women who began screaming, "El Matador," the killer. Ramirez panicked and ran. He was chased through the streets of an East Los Angeles neighborhood by a growing mob of angry residents who eventually cornered him and subdued him until the police arrived. The man who had held the entire region in a grip of fear was captured by its own citizens, all because he had carelessly adjusted a rearview mirror. This case highlights the power of a single forensic oversight. Ramirez was a killer who thrived on chaos and fear, but he was not forensically sophisticated. His failure to wipe down the car, a simple act of caution, was his undoing. The fingerprint on the mirror was the silent, irrefutable testimony that gave the phantom a name. It is a classic example of how the most basic and established of forensic techniques can bring down even the most terrifying of predators. If fingerprinting was the forensic revolution of the early 20th century, then DNA analysis was the quantum leap of the late 20th century. The ability to identify an individual from a microscopic trace of their biological material, blood, semen, saliva, skin cells, or a single strand of hair, fundamentally changed the landscape of criminal investigation. For serial killers, it meant that the very act of entering a crime scene, of interacting with a victim, created a massive risk of leaving behind an invisible, undeniable calling card. Leaving behind DNA is arguably the single most critical mistake a modern killer can make. No case better illustrates the power of DNA to solve a long-dormant cold case than that of the Green River Killer. Between 1982 and the late 1990s, a predator haunted the area south of Seattle, Washington, preying on sex workers and young runaways. He would strangle his victims and dump their bodies in wooded areas, often near the Green River. The official victim count stands at 49, but he is suspected of murdering more than 90 women, making him one of America's most prolific serial killers. The Green River Task Force was a massive, multi-year investigation that interviewed thousands of people and pursued countless leads, but the killer remained elusive. One of their prime suspects was a local truck painter named Gary Ridgway. He had been arrested in 1982 on a prostitution-related charge and had come to the attention of the task force early on. He was interviewed multiple times and even passed the polygraph test. In 1987, investigators, still suspicious, obtained a saliva sample from him for future analysis. At the time, DNA technology was in its infancy. The techniques for extracting a clear profile from the small, degraded samples found at the crime scenes did not yet exist. The case grew cold. The task force was disbanded, and for over a decade, it seemed the Green River Killer would never be identified. But the evidence was carefully preserved, waiting for technology to catch up. By the late 1990s, new DNA techniques, specifically the use of polymerase chain reaction, PCR, to amplify tiny amounts of DNA, had become standard. In 2001, investigators decided to re-examine the preserved evidence from the Green River case using these modern methods. They were able to extract the killer's DNA profile from semen samples found on several of the earliest victims. They then ran this profile against the saliva sample that had been taken from Gary Ridgway 14 years earlier. It was a perfect match. On November 30, 2001, nearly 20 years after the first body was discovered, Gary Ridgway was arrested. Faced with the irrefutable DNA evidence, he confessed. In a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he agreed to lead investigators to the remains of his missing victims. The man who had been a prime suspect for years was finally and definitively linked to the crimes by a technology that barely existed when he committed them. Ridgway's mistake was twofold. First, he left his DNA at the crime scenes, an almost unavoidable act during a sexual assault. Second, he provided a sample to police years earlier, believing he was clever enough to beat the system. He could not have anticipated that this sample, stored away in an evidence locker, would one day become the key to his conviction. The case was a landmark demonstration of the power of cold case investigation fueled by DNA. It sent a clear message. For killers who had left their biological signature behind, there was no longer a statute of limitations on justice. Just as the science of DNA was reaching its zenith, a new and even more powerful forensic tool emerged, one that would solve cases that even traditional DNA databases could not crack. This new technique, known as genetic genealogy, combines DNA analysis with the public's growing interest in tracing their ancestry. By uploading a killer's DNA profile from a crime scene to public genealogy websites, investigators can search for distant relatives of the perpetrator, and then use traditional genealogical research to build a family tree that leads directly to the suspect. This method has been the key to unlocking some of the nation's most infamous and coldest cases. For more than 40 years, a single, terrifying predator haunted the state of California. In the 1970s, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker on the East Area Rapist, a prolific burglar and serial rapist who terrorized communities from Sacramento to the East Bay. In the 1980s, he escalated to murder, moving to Southern California, where he was dubbed the original Night Stalker. The press and public would eventually combine these monikers, calling him the Golden State Killer. He was responsible for at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. Then, in 1986, he simply stopped. He vanished, leaving behind a legacy of terror and a trove of DNA evidence that, for decades, matched no one in any criminal database. The case was the white whale for a generation of California investigators. They had his DNA, they had his modus operandi, but they had no name. The advent of the National DNA Database, CODIS, in the 1990s offered a glimmer of hope, but the killer's profile never hit on a match. He was a ghost, a man who had seemingly committed a decade-long spree of horrific violence and then simply melted back into society. In the 2010s, a new group of investigators, led by Contra Costa County's Paul Holes, decided to try a radical new approach. They took the killer's DNA profile, which had been preserved from a rape kit from the 1980s, and, with the help of a genealogist, they uploaded it to an open-source genealogy website called GEDmatch. This site allows users to upload their raw DNA data from companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe to find relatives. The search didn't return a direct match, but it did something almost as powerful. It identified a number of the killer's distant relatives, his third and fourth cousins. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Working with an FBI genealogist, the team began the painstaking process of building out the family trees of these distant relatives, looking for common ancestors who lived in California in the 19th century. They were essentially reverse engineering the killer's family tree. After months of meticulous work, they traced a branch of one of these family trees down to 2 living male suspects. One was ruled out. The other was a 72-year-old former police officer named Joseph James D'Angelo, who lived in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, right in the heart of the East Area rapist's original hunting ground. He fit the profile. He was the right age. He had been a police officer during the time of the crimes, which would explain his knowledge of investigative techniques, and he had been fired for shoplifting, an event that coincided with the end of the rape series. Now, they needed his DNA to confirm the link. They put D'Angelo under surveillance. Investigators collected a sample of his DNA from the door handle of his car and another from a tissue he had discarded in a trash can outside his home. The samples were rushed to the lab and compared to the crime scene DNA of the Golden State Killer. It was a perfect match. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested at his home. The man who had eluded capture for 4 decades, the phantom who had haunted an entire state, was finally identified. His mistake was not made in the 1970s or 80s. His mistake was being born into the age of genetic information. He had left his DNA at his crime scenes, and in the 21st century, that DNA became a genealogical roadmap that led investigators directly to his front door. The capture of the Golden State Killer was a watershed moment, opening the floodgates for this technique to be used to solve hundreds of other cold cases across the country. This method was also used to capture the grim sleeper, Lonnie Franklin Jr. in Los Angeles, though in a slightly different way. In his case, a familial DNA search of the state's criminal database found a partial match to his son, who had been arrested on a felony charge. This led police to investigate the father, Lonnie Franklin, and they obtained his DNA from a discarded pizza crust to confirm the match. Both cases demonstrate the expanding power of DNA. The killer's own genetic code and that of their family becomes the ultimate informant. Our final mistake is a bookend to our first. We began with Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, a man from a bygone era whose downfall was his ignorance of what was, even in 2005, relatively simple technology. This technological naivety is a mistake that has become increasingly common and increasingly fatal for criminals in the digital age. The world is saturated with technology that tracks, records, and archives our every move. For a killer, navigating this world without leaving a digital footprint is nearly impossible. Every cell phone ping, every search engine query, every social media post, and every swipe of a credit card is a potential clue. The modern killer operates in a world of ubiquitous surveillance. CCTV cameras are on every street corner, on every storefront, and in every ATM. Doorbell cameras capture the comings and goings of entire neighborhoods. Dash cams record traffic on the highways. Everyone carries a high-definition video camera in their pocket. The chances of being recorded, either at the crime scene, disposing of evidence, or with the victim, have increased exponentially. The killer is no longer just trying to avoid human witnesses. They are trying to avoid the unblinking eye of thousands of digital witnesses. Digital forensics has become one of the most critical components of any modern investigation. A suspect's computer and cell phone are virtual treasure troves of evidence. Search histories can reveal a killer's planning and research, queries about how to dispose of a body, the routines of a victim, or the specifics of a particular poison. Location data from a phone's GPS can place a suspect at the scene of the crime with pinpoint accuracy. Text messages and emails can reveal motives, threats, and confessions. In the past, a killer's thoughts and plans were locked inside their own mind. Today, they are often outsourced to a search engine. This digital monologue provides profilers and investigators with an unprecedented window into the killer's psyche. The very tools they use to plan their crimes become the tools of their own undoing. And attempts to delete this information are often futile. Forensic experts can recover deleted files, browser histories, and text messages, peeling back the layers of a digital device to reveal its secrets. This new reality represents a paradigm shift in criminal investigation. The margin for error has shrunk to nearly zero. The classic mistakes, taunting police, leaving witnesses, keeping souvenirs, are all amplified by technology. A taunting letter is now a traceable email. A witness is now a high-resolution security camera. A souvenir is now a geotagged photo on a cloud server. The fundamental flaws of the criminal mind, ego, carelessness, compulsion, remain the same. But the tools used to exploit those flaws have become infinitely more powerful. As we look back on these 20 mistakes, a clear picture emerges. The serial killer is not a mythical beast of superior intellect. They are deeply flawed human beings, driven by pathologies that often include self-destructive narcissism, a lack of foresight, and an inability to control their compulsions. Their mistakes are not anomalies. They are an inevitable byproduct of who they are. They are undone by their own egos, by their need to be the smartest person in the room, a belief that leads them to play games with police they cannot win. They are caught because they fail to anticipate the fierce will to survive in their victims, leaving behind a living witness who can tell the world what they have done. They are captured because of their mundane, everyday errors, a traffic violation, a parking ticket, a plumbing problem, that shatter their illusion of being above the ordinary rules of life. And increasingly, they are being caught by the relentless march of science and technology. They leave behind invisible clues, fingerprints, bite marks, fibers, and the very code of life in their DNA that can wait patiently for decades until the right technology comes along to give them a voice. They operate in a world that is constantly watching, recording, and remembering, a digital panopticon from which it is becoming ever more difficult to hide. The so-called golden age of serial murder in the latter half of the 20th century was a product of its time, a time of less sophisticated forensics, a lack of interagency cooperation, and a more anonymous society. That era is over. The number of active serial killers has been in steady decline for decades, a testament to these advancements. The story of how serial killers are caught is, in the end, a story of their own fallibility. It is a chronicle of the fatal flaws that lie beneath the monstrous facade. It is a reassuring truth in a dark and often frightening world, that for every predator who believes they are invisible, there is a mistake waiting to be made, a clue waiting to be found, and a dedicated investigator waiting to find it. The myth of the criminal mastermind is just that, a myth. The reality is one of human error, and in that error, we find the seeds of justice.